All right, let's jump right into it. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are crunching the numbers on Senator Larissa Waters, running her straight through the 343 Vector Kanon protocol. Now, since we already know exactly how the Australian Kanon operates, we aren't going to waste time re-explaining the matrix today. Instead, we're giving you a point-by-point rundown of Waters' score, highlighting her most notable answers and reviewing her exact mathematical footprint within the overall Australianism audit. So, skipping the basics, let's look at the raw data. She hits a final Australianism score of 65.8%. That's 226 out of 343. What that number actually tells us is we're looking at an intense mix of high will friction and serious ideological alignment. This is definitely not a passive score. This is a highly polarized result that actively stresses the boundaries of the traditional Commonwealth identity. And the audit actually gives her this amazing overarching metaphor. It calls her the Sisyphus of the modern Australian experiment. It's such a vivid picture, right? Just constantly rolling this massive boulder of foundational reform straight up the very steep hill of lucky country complacency. Keep this image in your head, because her specific vector scores completely back up this characterization. Moving right along to Plane 1, the Who, our identity audit. Here, Waters clocks an authenticity rating of 0.43 out of 1. Breaking this down, she absolutely maxes out the Leriken and Battler metrics, scoring a +1 on both. Why? Well, she actively challenges authority and treats climate action as this massive moral struggle against the big extractive giants, the classic mud crushers. But, and it's a big but, she takes a hard hit with a -1 on the Menzies-era forgotten people metric. This just perfectly illustrates the friction in her identity profile. On one side, she is a fierce champion for the structural underdog, totally locking down those traditional Bush archetypes. But on the flip side, she completely alienates that quiet, outer suburban electorate, the folks just looking for stability. Her reform agenda threatens that suburban stasis, which really puts a ceiling on her overall authenticity rating. Okay, let's shift over to Plane 2, Westminster, which measures her legislative performance when it comes to the institutional fair go. Looking at the data here, she is undeniably a high-will player. She scores a +1 for defending the universal floor, the constituent franchise, and another +1 for using mechanisms like the Royal Commission to expose corporate rot. But the audit throws up some red flags too. She gets slapped with -1 fails on both the nanny state and the gridlock vectors. Essentially, her heavy regulatory reflexes and use of environmental vetoes register as a statistical risk for systemic seizure of traditional industry. So the real takeaway on Plane 2 is her source of power. She operates entirely on the stockade logic, earning a +1 for channeling that classic Eureka Rebellion antagonism toward modern squatters. Because of that, she gets a -1 as the subject. She absolutely refuses to play the humble, passive subject waiting on the crown. For her, it's all about demanding horizontal power, not bowing to vertical compliance. Next up, we are synthesizing planes 3, 4, and 5 to look at geography, drive, and method, or what the audit famously calls her retreat to the rim. Structurally speaking, she completely abandons the classical Australian tyranny of distance and our usual reliance on geology luck. Instead, she goes all in on the coast and First Nations land connections, completely rejecting the extractive logic of the red center and suburban sprawl. For Waters, the land is a sacred trust, absolutely not just a patchwork economy waiting to be dug up. And because of that geography, her drive vectors are wildly polarized. She crushes the proactive volunteer metric, getting a +1 for taking crisis action for the collective benefit. But she completely tanks on the lucky country and tall poppy vectors. By rejecting our traditional reliance on digging stuff out of the ground and actively cutting down resource achievers, her opponents on the Kanon structurally perceive her as a knocker, basically someone who hampers the traditional have-a-go energy of industry. But even with all that friction, her methodology is flawlessly, undeniably Australian. She nails a +1 on the uniquely local stringy bark and greenhide metric. This means she's a master of the bricoleur method, showing incredible improvisational agility and procedural cleverness on the Senate floor to actually get things done within the Commonwealth's umpire system. Breaking down that process a bit more, she aligns perfectly with organized action as the unionist and leans heavily into the black box of forensic truth through the whistleblower vector. But here's the catch. Her relentless urgency for reform causes her to fail the smoko vector with a -1. Basically, she refuses to give the electorate a break, constantly pushing against the everyday person's desire to just pause and rest for a minute. All right, now we hit Plane 6, the cause, focusing specifically on the First Nations correction.
And honestly, this is the vector that completely alters her mathematical and moral standing in the canon. By firmly anchoring her identity as a primary agent dismantling terra nullius, the greatest colonial lie, she creates a massive mathematical shift. Her base settler-only morality was a pretty modest plus 0.13, but once anchored in that truth, her integrated morality leaps up to plus 0.35. That gives us a massive correction delta of plus 0.22.
Now this delta is absolutely critical. In the strict logic of the canon, it proves that her pushback against traditional extraction and industry isn't just some blind antagonism. Instead, by focusing on resolving unfinished business, her entire profile transforms into a calculated, systemic trajectory of historical repair.
Let's pull all this data together for our final synthesis, mapping out her legacy effects to find her ultimate placement in the canon.
Her legacy vectors are laser-focused. She scores +1s on renewable transition and the Asian century for prioritizing active planetary transformation and geographical integration. But to get there, she intentionally sacrifices the quiet Australian and the homeowner metrics. She takes -1s there, because her high-tension activism constantly clashes with the passive logic of property hoarding and suburban retreat. When we average all her vectors across the 7 planes, it creates a really fascinating synthesis. She boasts a highly elevated morality vector of plus 0.72, and that's driven into reality by a solid, proactive will vector of plus 0.48. This tells us she has an intense vision of universal benefit, paired with the systemic energy to actually make it happen.
And that specific mathematical combination lands her squarely in the top left quadrant of the audit matrix, the quadrant of grace. So, despite all the severe friction she causes with traditional industry, the Kanon maps her into this state of proactive synergy, simply because her ultimate goals align with universal benefit rather than self-extraction.
So what does this all mean? What's the ultimate takeaway? Well, the audit proves she truly is the Sisyphus of foundational reform. She acts as a necessary Leriken check on the system's extractive wealth, pursuing a genuine trajectory of enlightenment. But the audit also flashes a major warning sign. She constantly flirts with what the canon calls the Tyrant's Delusion, which is the very real danger of relying way too heavily on suppressive, gridlocking bureaucracy to force those moral outcomes onto the public.
So, looking purely at the canon data we've explored today, I want to leave you with this question to chew on. Does her placement in the Quadrant of Grace actually justify her high-friction methods against traditional industry? Or will the risk of the Tyrant's Delusion ultimately alienate too many of the forgotten people she so desperately needs to achieve that final reform? It's a massive tension built right into the numbers. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the data, and I'll see you in the next deep dive.